So in study 1B, I had participants, I randomly assigned a sample of women to complete either the implicit gender self-stereotyping manipulation or they were randomly assigned to serve in the control condition, which meant that they simply completed the manipulation check or dependent variables. So in this task, the manipulation itself, the cover story was that it measures attention. So participants specifically were instructed to look for targets on each trial. The targets always consisted of one self-relevant word and one stereotype-relevant word. So for instance, here we have I and moody. If they were instructed, if they saw either of the targets on any given trial, to press the space bar. If they didn't see the targets, no response was required. So an example of a trial they would see on this manipulation task is word pairs. So this consisted of always one self-relevant word, one stereotype-relevant word. In this example trial, we see myself and weak, neither of which, if we take into consideration the sample targets here, I and moody, neither of those are the targets, so no response would be required. In this sample trial, we see I complaining. I is one of the targets, so they need to press the space bar. In this sample trial, the words are mine and vulnerable, neither of which are the targets, so no response would be required. In this sample trial, we see me and moody. Moody is one of the targets, so the participants would need to press the space bar. In this trial here, the words are my and materialistic, neither of which are the targets, so no response would be required. So in this task, one more thing. In this task, it consisted of 5 blocks of 25 trials each, and each of these trials was presented for 1,500 milliseconds. I wanted to note that the stereotype-relevant words here, so weak, complaining, vulnerable, moody, and materialistic, were used consistently in the manipulation and the manipulation check variables, and used consistently across all the studies. And these stereotype-relevant words were pre-tested in study 1A for both valence and gender relevance. So presumably, this implicit gender self-stereotyping manipulation is priming the constructs of self and negative female stereotypes, which activates the pre-existing association between these two constructs. Also in study 1B, I administered 2 manipulation check measures. So I wanted to make sure that the manipulation was indeed activating these implicit gender self-stereotyping associations. So first I used a me, not me task to assess implicit gender self-stereotyping, and this task presents stereotype-relevant and irrelevant traits one at a time in the center of the screen, and participants are asked to classify the words as quickly as possible using these 2 keys on the keyboard, which are yellow, and say me and not me. So for instance, participants saw the word weak and asked to classify it as quickly as possible as either me or not me. Similarly, they saw the words complaining, racist, and artistic, so a mixture of stereotype relevant and irrelevant traits. Next, I had participants rate the stereotype irrelevant and relevant traits on a scale of not very characteristic of me to very characteristic of me as a measurement of explicit gender self-stereotyping. So the results for study 1B, I'll go over the implicit data first. So on the y-axis here, we have implicit gender self-stereotyping. And in order to score this data, I took different scores. So differences in the latencies when the negative female stereotypes were classified as not me, minus the latencies when they were classified as not me. So higher numbers here represent stronger implicit self-stereotyping, and lower numbers represent weaker implicit self-stereotyping. So what I find here is that I find a significant difference in such that women in the experimental condition display or were faster to classify the negative female stereotypes as me than not me relative to the control condition. So there's a significant difference here, and the implicit gender self-stereotyping score in the self-stereotyping, the experimental condition here, is significantly different from 0, and it's not for the control condition. In addition, I found no differences in reaction time for any of the stereotype irrelevant traits across conditions. So this helps rule out the alternative explanation that this manipulation task is simply activating a negative state or a negative emotional state. So I also did not find any differences in explicit gender self-stereotyping across condition. So in study 2, I wanted to replicate and extend these findings from study 1B by demonstrating that only women are susceptible to this implicit gender self-stereotyping manipulation rather than men. So I had a sample of men and women complete this study. Again, I used the same manipulation from study 1B, where they were randomly assigned to complete the manipulation or to serve in the control condition, which meant that they just completed the manipulation check with dependent variables. So in this study, I used an implicit association test, or an IAT, to measure implicit gender self-stereotyping rather than the me, not me task. And this task requires 4 different categories of words. So the first were the same 5 negative female stereotypes from study 1B, materialistic, moody, complaining, and weak. Next, I used 5 masculine or 5 negative male stereotypes, violent, poor, mediocre, dangerous, and lower class, which were also pre-tested in study 1A. And these words were paired with 2 additional categories, the self and other related words. So an example of what participants would see in the implicit gender self-stereotyping IET, first of all, in this task, they were instructed to classify the stimuli as quickly as possible using the 2 blue keys on the keyboard. And in this example trial, this is a dual category sample trial where participants would see self and feminine paired on the upper left-hand part of the screen and other and masculine on the upper right-hand part of the screen. Then they would see the word moody in the center of the screen, and they would need to press the left blue key to classify as part of the feminine category. Next, in this sample trial, the category labels at the upper left and right-hand parts of the screen are flip-flopped, and participants would see the word violent in the center of the screen. So here, participants would need to press the right-hand blue key to classify as part of the masculine category. So the rationale underlying an IET is that when highly associated words share the same response key, participants typically classify them quickly and easily. However, when weakly associated words share the same response key, participants tend to classify them slowly and with greater difficulty. So women who display strong implicit gender self-stereotyping should perform this classification task significantly faster when self and feminine words share the same response key, while other and masculine words share the other response key, than when the classification task involves the opposite combination of words. So next, I had participants give self-report ratings of the stereotype stimuli used in the IET to measure explicit gender self-stereotyping. So the results for study 2, I found a significant gender main effect. So I'll first discuss the implicit data. So here we have on the y-axis implicit gender self-stereotyping IETD scores. So IETD scores represent the difference in the average response time between 2 critical category blocks divided by the pooled standard deviation. So higher numbers here represent stronger implicit feminine self-stereotyping, and lower numbers represent stronger implicit masculine self-stereotyping. So the results demonstrate that men display masculine implicit gender self-stereotyping, while women display feminine implicit gender self-stereotyping. These are significantly different from each other and from 0. Moving on to the explicit data, on the y-axis here we have explicit gender self-stereotyping, and I scored these so that they paralleled the IETD score. So again, higher numbers represent stronger explicit feminine self-stereotyping, and lower numbers represent stronger explicit masculine self-stereotyping. The results here demonstrate that both men and women display self-characterizations with the negative female stereotypes. However, women do so to a stronger extent, and these are both significantly different from 0. So I speculate here that men are interestingly showing a bias toward explicit female characterizations as a way to appear more chivalrous or empathetic towards women. So overall, these gender difference results provide evidence that these implicit and explicit gender self-stereotyping measures, the IET and the explicit data here, that they're reliable and valid. So in addition, and unfortunately, the predicted condition by gender interaction did not significantly affect the measurements of implicit or explicit gender self-stereotyping. So the first 3 studies allow me to develop and establish this manipulation of implicit gender self-stereotyping. And although study 2 didn't replicate the initial findings from study 1B, I proceeded to study 3 to test the effect of experimentally manipulating implicit gender self-stereotyping on women's self-esteem. So if this experimental manipulation is indeed activating implicit self-stereotyping associations, the manipulation should also have a series of theoretically predictable effects on other relevant outcomes, including implicit self-esteem. So the later portion of the study, studies 3 through 5, allow me to examine implicit gender self-stereotyping as the mechanism or the process that underlies women's self-image and career attitudes. But also, because of these inconsistencies in the findings from studies 1B to 2, later on in study 5, I'll use a different manipulation to manipulate implicit self-stereotyping, and I'll discuss that later in much detail later on in the presentation. So in study 3, I was interested in how implicit gender self-stereotyping influences women's self-esteem. So in this study, I had a sample of women complete the same manipulation task as study 1B and 2, where they were randomly assigned to either complete the manipulation or to serve in the control condition, which meant that they just completed the dependent variables. And in this study, I used a well-established and highly reliable IAT to measure implicit self-esteem. This IAT used the same self and other related words from the implicit gender self-stereotyping IAT from the previous study, but also paired it with two new categories, good and bad words. In addition, I used the standard Rosenberg self-esteem scale to measure explicit self-esteem, in which participants were asked to rate statements on a disagree very much to agree very much scale. So two sample items are, I feel positive about myself, and I think I have a number of good qualities. So these are the results for the implicit self-esteem data. So here we have, again, IATD scores. So higher numbers represent relatively high implicit self-esteem. Lower numbers represent relatively low implicit self-esteem. So women, both in the control and the experimental conditions, display relatively high implicit self-esteem. However, women who are exposed to the manipulation display marginally higher implicit self-esteem relative to the control group. So this is in line with social identity theory, which argues that associating oneself with stereotypic in-group traits can make you feel included and prototypical. Lastly, I didn't find any differences in explicit self-esteem across the conditions.